It gives me great pleasure to turn the introduction of our guest of honor over to the good doctor, Isaac Asimov.
It is with great difficulty that I force myself to introduce somebody else as guest of honor. Ted Sturgeon is one of the oldies. And when I say that, I say it with intent to compliment. He's one of my kind. He and I and a few others were all Campbell's babies way back in the late 30s and early 40s, long before most of you were born. And we've been going on ever since, upholding the flag of great science fiction, despite all the attempts of the newies to spoil it. Ted Sturgeon is one of the few people in science fiction who has a law named for him. Now, in science, there are a million laws. Boyle's law, Charles' law, Gay-Lussac's law, and so on and so on and so on. The heck with it. In science fiction, I can think of hardly any. There are, of course, the 3 laws of robotics, but nobody says Asimov's laws, right? But they say Sturgeon's law. And Sturgeon's law is getting slowly so famous that it's being heard of outside science fiction. And Sturgeon's law is this: 9/10 of science fiction is crud. And the conclusion is, why not? 9/10 of everything is crud. Now, it will not have escaped your notice that we might consider under the classification of everything, the subclassification of the program of the 1972 Lunacon. There are 18 items on the program. 10% of 18 is 1.8. The 2 panels I was on can be considered the 0.8. And now we come to the one item that by Sturgeon's law is not crud. And by an odd coincidence, the not cruddiest part of the whole thing is good old Theodore himself, whom I have known and loved for more than 30 years, despite the fact that I'm only a little over 30 years old. Ted, he's beautiful.
You see this stuff all over me? It's called whelm. I must begin with this. I just have got to begin with this because I know what happened after if I didn't. Not long ago, I wrote something. I said, someone or other has said about definitions of science fiction. There are only really basically 3 kinds of science fiction. What if this goes on, and if only. And it was printed that way. And I got a very angry letter from the doctor who said, I said that, and when you quote that, it would be awfully nice if you said Asimov said that. So this statement and one other is attributable to Isaac Asimov. And may he be blessed and always forever known as the man who said the 3 ifs are those in science fiction. The other statement, incidentally, is attributable to Isaac Asimov is It's all right, honey. Your husband won't mind. I give you Asimov's law. When quoting Asimov, attribute. Not long ago, I was happily appointed official science fiction book reviewer for the New York Times Book Review. And I took this very seriously. And I spent most of last summer biting my nails about it and worrying about it and doing that peculiar thing which you ask yourself, well, what it is I really do believe. You always thought you knew what you believed, but suddenly you're faced with it. You have to operate from what you believe and what you think your whole subject is. So I wrote for the New York Times what I called my maiden speech. Now, this was published last March, and due to their space considerations, which are very heavy, and my prolixity, which means I talk too much, it was only published in part. Now, I've never read a speech in my life, but I do want this particular thing, because of its structure and because of what it says, and it's a statement of my feelings about my best beloved field, I would like to read it to you. And it's called A Dear Genre Letter. Among the many terms for species, branches, fields, categories, classes, and sorts of literature is the funny little expatriate genre. Easy to write, difficult to use casually in debate because it keeps coming out John. No matter, I'm saying goodbye to it anyway, even if though once upon a time we loved one another. This farewell is part of another, larger leave-taking. Like the invisible, odorless, and debilitating attrition of carbon monoxide, a pollutant called categorization has attacked the corpus of readership, tunneling its vision, dulling its taste buds, and doing ruinous things to its ability simply to compare. Of what else is the recognition of good writing made? 50 years ago, the stalls were heavy with magazines and books presenting fiction, just fiction. The Saturday Evening Post and Liberty and Collier's bought fiction about war and love and fantastic worlds and cowboys and thieves. There were All Story and Argosy and Red and Yellow and Golden Book. Yet further back, the novels of, for example, H.G. Wells in his prehistory period were written and reviewed and read simply as romances. In such a pellucid atmosphere, a writer could gain fame by his excellence, just that. This insidious pollutant has lost us the ability to read randomly, to pick up a book because we have a thirst to read, to say, pressurized with anticipation, tell me a story. Whole generations have grown up afflicted. Not long ago, I handed a magazine to a 10-year-old boy, pointed to a paragraph and said, this should interest you. He got his hands on it properly and his nose aimed, and then he asked, what is it about? Note, he wanted the category before he put his eyes in gear, and he wanted it from sources extraneous to the matter on the page. I am not for a moment suggesting that all literature be merchandised in plain brown wrappers. We have our individual tastes and preferences and capacities and the right to gratify them, and authors and publishers have the pleasant duty of signaling to us as to what they have for us and where it may be found. What I do object to is that inevitable side effect of categorization, the qualitative assignment. That is, once you call it a dog story, it becomes a kiddie book. Detective and mystery novels are automatically hard-heeling and pulpy. Science fiction and is spaceships and zap guns and bad writing about sex without sex. Westerns are, well, westerns. And finally, and most unjustly, that if it's found in a paperback, especially if it's a paperback original, it is in some way beneath serious attention or serious criticism. This is not a brief for the second rate, an insight which came to me during a hot debate in which my opponent stated that Isaac has said this so much better. This is about Sturgeon's law. The obverse of that medallion is a small percentage of every kind of fiction is well worth reading by any, including the very highest standards. And there you have the core of this plea. As a toddler, I was taught to judge people by what's in their heads and what's in their hearts, and nothing else. I think what my mother, who was English, had in mind was the striations of her early environment, matters of school, of background, of family and fortune, and the series of shocks she had to undergo before realizing that top rating in any or some or all of these categories was no guarantee of personal worthiness. Her ultimate codification was and is valid and can be extended to political convictions, race, and the appearance of an author in a disdained field or in a paperback original. My area of familiarity happens to be science fiction, latterly a dreadful misnomer, of which more below. But I'm willing to make of it a clear analogy of what has happened to all of us in our overview of all literature. We must, if for no other reason than to keep from being cheated, be prepared to acknowledge the existence of that small shining percentage of true excellence everywhere, and to seek it out and greet it, and without consideration of its clothes or its bank account or whether or not its parents were married or if it worships your God your way. In short, what's in its head and what's in its heart. In the age of the category, genre thrives. The reader of genre fiction knows, as my 10-year-old put it, what it's about. He can call it by name and settle down with it comfortably and get exactly what he paid for. What makes it what it is, Western, Gothic, detective, whatever, is its parameters. It may extend east and west just so far, north and south just so many degrees, up a bit and usually down not much. Your classic Western, for example, is and must be set in the last decades of the 19th century in the American Southwest and deal with events concerning or peripheral to the cattle trade. Any variations of these specifications will not exactly ban a narrative, but the extra fun involved is like the fun summed up by declaring deuces, nines, and one-eyed jacks wilds. You can expect your sour purist to kick the table over in a passion. And there is one of the essential quarters in this scutcheon of any genre. Everybody knows what it is. Its detractors know, and its adherents know. And though they may exchange insults and challenges, they do not agree on what it is they are fighting about. I beg your pardon, they do agree on what it is they're fighting about. So we come to science fiction, which is almost, at one time, a genre. But it isn't now, and it may never have been. The confines, the frontiers of genre fiction are imposed from without, agreed upon by all parties before they cross the border inbound. It is in this country that the author rings his changes, dances his Morrises, mixes his metaphors. Science fiction, on the one hand, shapes its own corpus by internal pressures, and there is only one body of people which knows what it is, the one which says, I never read science fiction. Or even, I don't like science fiction. And each and every one of these people is just plain wrong. Science fiction is not a genre because it has not the basic characteristics of a genre, a clearly defined operating area. It cannot therefore be treated as a genre, most especially by people who say they don't like it and continue to flock to the movies and bookstores to buy it. And they do buy it. We are in the midst of a science fiction boom and probably still on the rising side. Unhappily for some of its practitioners, however, it seems to be most marketable when it isn't called science fiction and when it is written by people who never appeared on the tables of contents of Analog or Galaxy or the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. Most readers and viewers of science fiction are as unaware of what they are purchasing as was Moliere's amateur gentleman that he had been all his life speaking prose. Ezekiel was writing science fiction when he saw that flying saucer. And Lucian of Samosata with his Icaromenopause. Cyrano wrote it, as did Rabelais, Voltaire, Samuel Butler, and of course Swift. A journalist named Richard Locke held the readers of the New York Sun enthralled by a continuing account of a super telescope invented by the contemporary astronomer Herschel, by which he could report on the doings of the inhabitants of the moon, all going well until it was revealed that while Herschel had not invented the telescope, Locke had invented the story. Verne, Wells, of course, and Poe, the DNA of all three is strongly evident in each cell of this wise child. I have a book out of Scribner's edited by Harry Harrison called The Light Fantastic, which contains science fiction by Anthony Burgess, Gerald Kirsch, Kingsley Amis, who once mordantly described the general public's attitude towards science fiction thus: "This is good. It can't be science fiction." And "This is science fiction. It can't be good." Mark Twain, Graham Greene, Jorge Luis Borges, Robert Graves, E.B. White, E.M. Forster, Leo Szilard, John Cheever, Rudyard Kipling, and C.S. Lewis. Tennyson wrote it, and so did Stephen Vincent Benet. Only poetry rivals science fiction in its ability to create and exploit alternatives without hindrance and without horizons. Latterly, quite a few works, which anyone must call unabashed science fiction, like 2001 and The Andromeda Strain, have cleared the top of the charts, and Kurt Vonnegut Jr. won a Pulitzer. But before and between these, dozens of popular and provocative books and films have been, unbeknownst to most of their enthusiastic audiences, de facto science fiction. 7 Days in May, Dr. Strangelove, Lord of the Flies, The Fox in the Attic, Nabokov's Ada, The Poorhouse Farm, 1984. The list is endless. Exactly what, then, is science fiction? It would be nice to be able to present a clear-cut definition, and then it could be categorized and put in its proper place. But it won't be categorized, and it won't behave like a genre, and it won't even be consistently defined. Every year there's a major convention, international in scope, each one held in a different city and occasionally in a different country. In between times and concurrently, for the benefits of those who can't make it to the conventions, are regional meetings and conferences, together with an increasing number of seminars, workshops, summer courses, and the like. At each of these gatherings, large and small, sooner or later emerges the question of a definition of science fiction. Always there's intense argument. Often there is fighting. Yet in spite of the fact that these clusterings are composed of the most devout adherents to the field and the most skilled practitioners, none has yet come up with a satisfactory definition. Each, as rendered, and I mean rendered like fat, with heat and smoke, seems only to evoke exceptions. Most seem to be cast in lumpy and uncadenced prose. All of them leak. The confusion extends to publishers, who, while aware of the boom, are uncertain about how to present it. Here's a collection containing half mainstream or non-science fiction stories, and the whole package is presented as science fiction. Here's a swords and sorcery novel topping this month's science fiction line. Here's another novel bearing all the folds and whorls of the science fiction ID, which has, quote, science fiction mentioned nowhere on the jacket or in the catalog. In short, the publishers don't know what it is or what to say it is any more than do the readers and writers. The real problem in this labeling age is semantic. Science fiction is a first-order misnomer. One or two of Jules Verne's short stories and a few of the amazing stories of the 30s were written in order to teach, or at least to inform, in the area of hard science, and had explanatory footnotes about the chemistry or physics or astronomy used in the narrative. Excuse me. Maybe that was real science fiction. Perhaps it was the only real science fiction that ever existed. Far and away, most of what preceded it, and virtually all that has followed, however, has been quite something else. It was during this brief period, however, that it acquired the label, and that label has been an unnecessary burden to it ever since. I would like to suggest that the difficulty lies not in the widespread misunderstanding of what science fiction is, but in a misapprehension of the truly basic nature of science itself. Everybody knows what science is, right? Isn't it a guy in a white coat holding a test tube up to light? Let us go to Mr. Random's house for a definition. Science. Noun. 1. A branch of knowledge or study dealing with a body of facts or truths systematically arranged and showing the operations of general laws, as the mathematical sciences. 2. Systematic knowledge of the physical or material world. 3. Systematized knowledge in general. 4. Knowledge as of facts or principles, knowledge gained by systematic study. 5. A particular brand of knowledge. 6. Skill, proficiency. From the Middle English and the Latin scientia, knowledge. Here we have 6 clauses, 4 of which mention system as an essential, and 2 of which imply it. We have heard the term scientific method so often, the commanding scientific thinking so repeatedly, that the cliche has become an axiom. Systematics has everything to do with technology, but is only one of many tools in the truly basic area, which is scientia, knowledge. Think of science fiction, then, as knowledge fiction. One of the tools of the basic scientist is speculation, and though it can embody system per se, much of it may be intuitive and not systematic in any way we can as yet understand. Think of science fiction, then, as speculative fiction. Someone once hypothesized that there are only someone or other hypothesized that there are only 3 types of science fiction. Although all 3 may appear in a single narrative. What if this goes on, and if only. The operative concept in each of these is that tiny, immense, nuclear word, if. Think of science fiction, then, as if fiction. The penalties of having this body of literature called science fiction have been grievous to the inhabitants of several levels of the literary planet. A writer of genuine talent who happens to have wed the form early and is faithful to her is ghettoized for it. Often when he tries to break into what is called the mainstream, another label worthy of an inquisitive essay, finds that he has his fidelity forced upon him. The publisher turns him down and wants more science fiction. I have known a writer of science fiction willing to do a mainstream novel under a pseudonym, and again be refused by a publisher who, contrarily, just might want to use the writer's reputation and awards in science fiction to help sell the book. More astonishing than any product of a science fiction writer's imagination is the simple fact that so few of them are certifiably paranoid. Numerically, the greatest loser to this strange mistrust of the label is the general reading public. For while the science fiction not written by science fiction writers has always had and is gaining its readership, these works are usually structured around concepts born in the 30s and 40s and long ago superannuated within the field. What is now happening within the field is simply extraordinary. Not only are new and exciting writers emerging like tumbleweeds, but their work is original, pertinent, relevant, leavened, and alive. Caution, Sturgeon's law applies still. Yet it is a true point. Why this ghettoization, this mistrust? At first blush, the horrible examples of sloppy writing and stupid horror movies seem to suffice, but they don't. There is no other field so subject to taint by its own worst examples. Editors and readers who are reflexively competent to discriminate between Mickey Spillane and Graham Greene, or Hopalong Cassidy and the Red Pony, seem utterly unaware of the skill, the care, the ingenuity, and the profundity of the better science fiction writers, and consign the whole field to the 25th century wrapped up in a brightly colored comic book. Why should this be? I think I have an answer. Here, Robin Scott Wilson, author and essayist, professor of English, and originator of the workshop at Clarion College. Quote, one can see that modern science fiction poses a peculiar dilemma. On the one hand, however remotely, science is a tremendous influence on the quality of all of our lives. On the other, it has penetrated ever more deeply into a temple of abstractions whose mysteries are not understandable to very many people. We are being moved by forces we no longer comprehend. Science, which bid fair to unlock the mysteries of the universe, has itself come to constitute a mystery of very nearly equal obscurity. Technology, the means the man has employed to deal with a hostile nature, has itself produced a new environment in many ways, far more hostile. Something there is that threatens us grievous bodily harm, that promise us health and longevity, that leads to technologies which poison our air, our water, our mother's milk, that has virtually eliminated poliomyelitis, that invents cyclamates, and then tells us they are carcinogens. We don't understand what it is, and it worries us. That's end quote. There is one force driving us which at least equals the pressure of sex, and that is the urge to worship. Take away our churches and we will worship a baseball player. Further, we will then persistently use his nickname. Back in the days of Rabelais, in an age of faith, it was a hip thing to tell risque stories about priests and nuns. In its defiant reversal, clearly an affirmation of the act of worship. The impact of Freud on the world has its fallout of jokes about kooky psychiatrists. Again, an affirmation. Look again at Professor Wilson's paragraph. Have you ever seen a more lucid description of a primitive, unpredictable, ununderstandable, implacable deity? Do we worship science? You can bet your holy tithe we do. And do we jump at the chance of scorning something with science as part of its name? I submit to you that this is the source of the effort to make of science fiction a kind of hobby box for retards, a genre, which, rather frighteningly, it simply refuses to be. I do believe that with any other name, extrapolative or speculative or knowledge fiction, it would not have been so snobbishly, shabbily treated. I will grant you for the third time that most of what is published as science fiction is inexcusable trash. As for the rest of it, one of the highest tributes I have ever heard paid to a writer lies in the words of a young lady who said, "I knew halfway through the second paragraph that I was in good hands." Science fiction has produced many a pair of such hands, and I genuinely envy those who have yet to encounter them, the experience which awaits. Oh, just wait till you first encounter R.A. Lafferty, a totally uncontrollable Irishman so intoxicated by words and their magic and their taste and texture and cadence that I do believe you could read them aloud to somebody who knows no English and enchant him with sound. Roger Zelazny, who dares to place an arrogant poet as an essential member of a Mars expedition and have him use Ecclesiastes to establish cultural contact. And there's Robert Silverberg, for years a completely competent writer, who in the past too seems to have vaulted into a new order of magnitude. Or D.G. Compton, whose characters, like yours, can never be completely understood. Or Joanna Russ, who is not afraid of womanness or loving. I am reminded of Sherwin Anderson's description of the quality he calls tandy. Tandy is the power to be strong, to be loved. And there's J.G. Ballard, who clearly feels that there's more room in inner space than in outer space, and presents unique and subjective realities. And. Sex has at long last taken its place in the field, and is, I think, much less often abused in science fiction than elsewhere. As to what's coming, I could hardly do you a greater favor than to suggest that you get from Signet Robin Scott Wilson's Clarion, an anthology of new writings from participants in his Clarion College workshop, plus essays by the staff and visiting lecturers. So, farewell to science fiction as genre, and to the larger chore of defining the field. I sincerely hope that this is the last time I shall ever feel it necessary to try. I shall acknowledge, with writer, editor, anthologist Damon Knight, that we are stuck with the misnomer and that, quote, it will do us no particular harm if we remember that science fiction means what we are pointing to when we say it. Well, that was my article for the Times, and the first and most immediate response, I'm going to read you that one bit. I am saying goodbye to this effort to define this stuff, was a very warm and kind letter from the Encyclopedia Americana asking if I would do their article on it. Now, I could not have been more pleased to have shared part of this whole program with Paul Krasner, a man I admire tremendously as one of the most courageous human beings I think who ever lived. He's one of the kookiest too, but he's one of the most courageous. I was intensely interested in what he had to say about the infiltration of the CIA and of the whole business of, well, Orwell said it, Big Brother is watching you. I happen to have been preoccupied very much in the last few weeks with just that particular image. And it's a terrifying one. It really is. I live in L.A., and there's one of those local newspapers they throw up on your lawn every week, and it's got the coupons that you clip and you get the Clorox for cheaper, you know, by Wednesday, that kind of thing. And all of the front page is given over to, well, there's going to be a Girl Scout meeting Saturday night, and we're gathering up crutches for the so-and-so. You know, it's a nice little neighborhood paper. However, it subscribes to something called the Capital News Service, which originates in Sacramento, which is the state capital out there. And it's run by a guy apparently called Pat Michaels. I've never met him, but I've met somebody since this happened who knew him, and he says he's a two-fisted, old-line newspaper man, vastly underpaid and understaffed, who goes out and gets his own stories. So on the front page of this nice neighborhood newspaper, I see a one-column story, and it said something to the effect of a secret bank law now in operation. And it went on to tell this perfectly incredible story. Every one of your checks, every withdrawal from a savings account, every loan you make, every bank transaction of any kind is microfilmed, and the films are held for the United States government. The covering memo to banks making this an operating thing said that the memo itself must be kept from the public, and gave the authority for all this as Public Law number 95-108. This absolutely chilled me. My goodness. I mean, even a check for $2.40 for the Eggman or something, or any check you draw, or any deposit you make, and it's being microfilmed. One other thing was that any transaction of $5,000 or more must be reported within the hour to the IRS. And a computer now can do things like this. But what about this covering memo to bank presidents, to bank managers, saying that this must be withheld to the public? I mean, who said this, you know? So I scurried around and tried to get a hold of a copy of Public Law number 95-108. And believe it or not, you probably heard the echoes of 95-108 a little over a year ago when you heard on the radio that if you lost your credit card, you would no longer be responsible for the any purchases that might be made on it, that this is now the risk of the people who issued the card. That is Title V of Public Law number -95-108. The other four titles are couched in such bewildering legalese that I really don't blame the people in Congress who passed it for passing it. I mean, one look at that spaghetti and you don't know what it says. What it does say in Title I is that the Secretary of the Treasury is hereby empowered to get what records he sees fit in the banking community of the United States. That's what it says, and that's the enabling thing. Titles 2, 3, and 4 are just convolutions on that and go into various very highly technical financial subjects. Title 5 is the one about the credit cards, and that's the one that got all the publicity. Title I is truly terrifying, and it's terrifying for this reason. Krasner, of all people, knows the technique of finding out if a law is a valid law or not by going out and breaking it. Now, I'm not particularly suggesting that anybody be a lawbreaker, but nevertheless, the fact remains that the ability to test a law lies in the fact of you're going out and breaking the law and getting busted for it. And if you're willing to pay the penalty to get it on the books, just the way that King did when he had everybody riding the buses up front, that was breaking a law. And ultimately the law was tested. A lot of people got hurt. A lot of people got arrested. But the law went by the boards. And well, it should. But this is something really worth watching for. There isn't any way any of us can break this law. It has been once removed from any possibility of testing it for constitutionality or anything else. Only a bank could break that law by refusing to microfilm checks. And they're not about to do that. We can't break this law. Therefore, we can't test this law against the Constitution. Now, this is where to watch for Big Brother. This is the way it sidles in. This is the way it can happen. I happen to have had a love affair for a long time with the Constitution of the United States. It's an absolutely extraordinary document. And how that happened was that I was reading randomly in the Encyclopedia Britannica, and it was the 11th edition, which was published in 1910. And there's an article in that 11th edition on the U.S. Constitution that absolutely blew my mind. This guy, too, had fallen in love with it, but he was an Englishman, and he was writing, as I say, 65 years ago. And he told me things about our Constitution that I had never known. I had the usual schooling and the usual treatment and so forth about Constitution. We went through it, too, article by article. But I never knew the things that it said. For example, the mechanical structure of the Constitution is so extraordinarily deft. It's simple, but it's so clever. In this, a senator has a term of 6 years, and a representative has a term of 2. And those 2-year terms are, they can all come at the same election day, whereas the Senate must be staggered. Every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate gets reelected or is up for reelection. This is a purely mechanical thing, but I never understood why. It took this 5-year-old Englishman to explain it to me. The reason is that, as he said, the House of Representatives, in a sweep of a motion, can get turned bottom to top in a single day. Some huge emotion could sweep the whole country. But in the Senate, no more than 33% of it could be turned out of office. A majority of 2/3 always remains of what he called older and wiser heads. And this is absolutely a mechanical thing. And as long as that obtains, the whole country cannot be turned upside down overnight by a sweep of emotion of one sort or another. It doesn't matter whose emotion. I'll tell you something very interesting. Back in the 50s, there was a constitutional amendment proposed, which, because it costs so much to run for office and because things are much tighter today and we're not riding horseback with the news and so forth, it'd be much simpler to raise the term of the term of the congressman from 2 years to 4, and reduce that from the Senate from 6 years to 4, and have everybody elected on the same day. And it sounds like a very reasonable thing. It was called the Johnson Amendment. It was written by Lyndon Johnson. True. Look out for that one. If in the future you ever see such a thing coming up where anybody suggests changing that extraordinary structure of our elections, where the more than 1/3 of the Senate could ever be reelected in one day, just look out. Now, this kind of thing, and what Paul has been talking about, to me is the function of science fiction. That's what it's for. We got to be watching Big Brother. We got to watch him very hard. We're in a unique position to be able to do it because we live in the present and in the future, which is where we've all got to live anyway, right? So, join me in gratitude for just being involved in science fiction. And I don't think I could ever say anything more than that. And thanks very much.